In looking at Luke chapter 6 and beginning in verse 36, by the way, those of you with notes, if you look on the back, you have next week's notes. Kathy and I are leaving after church, and we'll be putting our feet up in 110-degree weather, whatever that means, down in Palm Springs, so we're going to be gone. And I thought I'd better get my act together before I go. So you have next week's sermon on the back of your sheets, so don't leave them behind. As we consider the Sermon on the Mount beginning in Luke 6, verse 20, all I can say is that I wish that when I was a young man, when I had first come to Christ, that someone had done more than just say, read the Sermon on the Mount. Because reading it, I mean, how many times have you read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God," and you go, I don't get it. What's poor in spirit? And if they had explained to me just some of the basic words and some of the basic concepts, but the bigger concept that the Sermon on the Mount is an unveiling of what the gospel is all about, lived out through those who have embraced it. It's not just pie-in-the-sky notions that have been quoted and abused by Christians and the world down through the centuries. Because, I'm going to say it, because of ignorance. Because they interpret the words based upon what the English words say rather than what Jesus' intent was. And I'm going to just remind you before we get to the first words in verse 36 that when Jesus said, "Blessed the poor," and I've said this already just about every sermon on the Sermon on the Mount, blessed the poor are blessed the beggarly. Because the word poor is even rich compared to what the word is. And it's the beggarliness of our own spirits, our own souls before God. And another word that fits or fulfills the figure here is the word humility, humbleness. We do not walk into the presence of God and announce our presence and say, okay, if you wouldn't mind moving over just a little bit, then I can sit down and maybe show you how the universe ought to be run. We in our human pride tend to do those kind of things. The beggarly in spirit looks upward and says, He is God, I am not, I am broken, He is whole, He is the one who can make me well. Heal my soul of its sin. Set me on the right path. Build me up. Love me in my broken condition. That's where it starts, and it builds from there. And with that we have, of course, we have the blesseds on the one side, the woes on the other. And then we have the statements that are grow out of that. In verse 27, I say to those who hear, that's those who will listen, not just those who show up. The church has a lot and too many that just show up. It's those who hear that Jesus can actually speak to. So in 27 he says, I say to you who hear, love your enemies. And we've already gone through that, so I'm not going to re-preach this sermon, but those things that he mentions in 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35 are things that are outgrowths of the heart condition that is rightly in relationship with God. I have to say that right relationship with God the ultimate humility or beggarliness is to realize our sinful condition and the surrender to Him of His only path to Him through Jesus Christ, His Son. That's the beginning. But it's not just like I've shared this before. I was trying to find out through an interview whether someone was a Christian or not. And finally they got frustrated at the end and they said, "I told you already, I prayed the prayer." And what I've been trying to say the whole time is that it's not just praying a prayer. The Sermon on the Mount is the living out of what God has put in. It's the transformation. The transformation of me. We all know our natural condition. If you're happy with that, you don't need to be in church. My natural condition is what makes me do the very things He says don't do. To hate my enemies, to do bad to those who do bad to me, to curse those who curse me, and so on. God's transforming power, the light and the life He's given me works itself out to where I do the supernatural. I love my enemies. Last week we covered the golden rule in verse 31. Just as you want men to treat you, treat them in the same way. The golden rule. I could not believe, in fact, I told somebody as they were talking to me about their struggle, I said, you know what? The golden rule has changed my life. And I told this person, it has changed the way I drive. And they did the same thing you just did. They laughed. And it truly has, because as I come up on a car that just got on the freeway and they're going 55 and they continue to go 55 and it's like you're on the freeway, and I'm thinking to myself, natural person, and then I remember do unto others as you would have do unto you. And I'm thinking, if that was me, would I want them on my bumper honking their horn or making fists? And the answer is no. So I back off and then look for a safe opportunity to pass. All of you who know me know that that's not natural. It is supernatural. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is life-changing, and that's only one of these things. Let us look at the first verse of the three today, verse 36. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Now, if you look at the King James, be ye therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful, there's really no difference. But if you look at Lenski, he says, go on being compassionate, even as your Father is compassionate. And so you say, well, why are those words, why is one mercy and why is one compassion? Well, if you look at the definition of compassionate, the definition is compassionate or merciful. So you go, okay. Compassion. Let me just read to you a little bit. And for those of you who did download the second sheet, I told you it was an expansion. That's all it was. I didn't print it out for you here because it was an expansion. If you wanted it, you got it. Vine describes it this way. Compassionate means, or the Greek word means pity, compassion for the ills of others. It's used regarding God because he is called the Father of mercies in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3. God's mercies, or God's compassion, are the grounds upon which believers are to present their bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable God, as our reasonable service in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 28, we find that if those who are under the law set the law apart, or they don't deal with it, they don't do anything with it, he says they die without mercy. They die without compassion. It's like, okay, so the heart of God's compassion deals with mercy. Dealing with men, believers are to feel and exhibit compassions one toward another. We saw that 13 years ago in Philippians chapter 2, verse 1. You remember the sermon, right? In Colossians 3, verse 12, we are supposed to have a heart of compassion. Now, mercy, or merciful, is showing compassion and forgiveness. So, the reason that I like the word, and it is a choice because they're both good, compassion is simply because mercy has to do with forgiveness in our minds more than compassion, which kind of deals in a sense with love in action. And so I'm going to go more with the sense of love in action. Let me do that. By the way, I consider that verses 36, 37, and 38 are precepts and the commensurate promises. So what we find in verse 36, the first thing is the word be. And by this time, you know that when I see a word that kind of jumps out and hits me between the eyes, I've got to share that with you. We kind of, in a sense, take the word be for granted. We're going to see the word be in here again, but not the same word, because we use it a lot. This word is the word for come to be, come about to be, in a sense, to make. So the word really deals with our being, our existence, if you will. Exist compassionately is a way you could say it, though that wouldn't be a direct translation of the Greek. It's present tense. It's a present tense imperative. When he says be, it's the same kind of concept as the word go. And we understand go because it's action. Be, it's like you don't move. Your being continues to be, to exist, but all of a sudden you're aware of it. So in your being, right now, whoever you are and however you're sitting there, be compassionate. That heart that looks at the ills of others, and it's going to play out more in the next couple things. But we have this, and I don't want to say feeling, though we oftentimes associate feelings with it, but an attitude of compassion. So compassion is that which flows out of the beggarly heart that we possess from verse 20. The poor in spirit, the beggarly in spirit before God. Compassion becomes our being. And what does he say? He says, go on being compassionate even as, in the same way as your Father is compassionate. Wow. Jesus here speaking to all of these and addressing God as your Father. Your Father. How special is that? But what is God like? Well, God is compassionate. And when all of a sudden you take it from yourself, and it's kind of like you, and it says be compassionate. He's talking to you, and all of a sudden Jesus says, as your Father is compassionate. All of a sudden you look up and you look into the face of God, and what do you see? You see the Creator God looking down at you and loving you like crazy, despite all of your foibles and all of your mistakes and all of your shortcomings. God is compassionate. So compassion is our being flowing out of our beggarly heart, and it reflects God's heart. So as we reflect God's heart, well, where does it go? It's kind of like if I had a mirror and I held it up to the sun, I could shine it right back to the sun and the sun would say, big deal. But if I did this and shone it in your face, all of a sudden you would be affected by that, wouldn't you? Well, think about reflecting the compassionate heart of God out this way. You see, it reflects God's heart from us, which he has given, out this way. So then who sees God's compassion? The world. The world sees God's compassion. They see it practically lived out by yours truly. And yours truly is whoever raises their hand. So, verse 36, be, that is, in your being, exist that way. What way is that? Compassionate. Well, let's see. What does compassion accomplish? It changes the way I look at others because my being adjusts to it. How many of us have struggled through the years with compassion and realizing that we fall short of it? And then we kind of hope that maybe a friend or a spouse or somebody else will step in and then they can be compassionate so you don't have to. But with this statement, there is no deflection. It is God's compassion upon me, and my being adjusts to it and reflects out. I love the fact, before we move on to verse 37, the fact that Parkhill's monthly giving, not to our missionaries only, but we have a $100 a month gift called Compassion. How appropriate is that? Because we look for someone in need to give it to. Somebody who can't do it themselves. We move on to, there it is. We move on to verse 37, where it says, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Now that's just the first one. The second one is, do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Okay? The next one is, pardon, and you will be pardoned. Okay? As soon as we see judge not, a whole bunch of things comes up. And I can picture the world pointing their finger at us Christians, and we judge, things that are sinful, and they throw this verse back in our faces. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Yeah, I can do what I want. There's a problem with that. What he is saying here with the judge not is that we do not want to replace the judge with ourselves. Who is the judge? I'll give you a hint. The righteous judge sits on the throne. If we judge, then there's prejudice and discrimination. It's the nature of our beast. This judging or prejudice is self-righteous, self-exalting, and hypocritical judging, which is false in its nature. God's judging is actually called down upon it. God's judging is called down upon our judging. So he says, be not judging, or do not judge, and you will not be judged. And by the way, that in the Greek, and do not judge, and it's a double negative. It's ume. It's not just u, and it's not just me, both negative words, but they're combined. It's kind of like, and you will in no way be judged. Now, In John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." So Jesus says, judge with righteous judgment. In 1 Corinthians 5:12, Paul says, "For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? We judge one another." Okay. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, John says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." We are called to judge doctrine. Man, I wish he'd drive down the part of the road that doesn't have bumps. Sorry for all of you. We are called to judge doctrine. You are called to judge me every Sunday. Every time I open my mouth as the one you recognize as teacher, in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament times, I'd be called rabbi if I was Jewish. But I am recognized as your teacher, as your shepherd. I am held accountable by you to go down the right path, to teach you the right things. Of course, that's not even to mention how God judges me. But the judging here is that which is self-righteous, self-exalting, and hypocritical. And I would say this because these will all bear out in verse 37. Don't judge, and you will in no way be judged. Do not go on condemning, and you shall in no way be condemned. Go on, or do pardon, or go on acquitting, and you shall be acquitted. There's two parts here. You have the precept, and then you have the promise. And the promise, I'm going to say this, the promise is fulfilled on the other side. Now just take the first one in verse 37. Don't judge, and you will in no way be judged. Do you think the church is not being judged today? Do you think the church is not being judged today? And when I say the church, I don't mean just Parkhill Community Church, but I mean God's church. God's church is being scrutinized and judged every day. Well, if we do not judge with self-exaltation, and by the way, I'm gonna dumb it down to this. I'm better than you because I don't do that. There, okay? That's a simple example of judging. I just judged you. I'm better than you because I don't do that. All right. I hope that gets that across. So, you shall in no way be judged is on the other side. You get into the presence of God, and what Jesus is doing here in the Sermon on the Mount is he's taken us beyond the bounds of this life into that which is what I would term real life, eternal life, on the other side, which is where we're all heading, whether you want to or not. We're all heading there. We'll get there, and when we get there, what's going to happen? My whole life, I've done this. I'm better than you because I don't do that. Or I'm better than you because I do that, and so on. So I get to heaven, and what do I got? My judgment is, are you kidding me? However, on the other hand, if I am compassionate, and in that I look upon people as people walking away from God's precepts and principles, and I'm going to pray for them and love them, and by God's grace they won't be who they are, then I get to the other side, and it's like, well done, thou good and faithful servant. You actually prayed every day this week for AOC? You did? By the way, that was a miracle that I did that, so most people wouldn't. And that's just showing you that God is working in my life. For those of you who don't know, AOC, it's a type of plug-in in the wall. We won't go any further. So we move on to the next one. Do not condemn. Now, condemnation is the application of judgment. Eventually, the judging will lead to something, condemnation. And I don't have any real examples of that. If any come to mind for you, that's fantastic. So what we don't want to do is condemn. And he says, do not condemn, and you shall in no way be condemned. So you're beginning to see a little pattern here of if this precept is obeyed, then this promise is good. The last one in verse 37, in the King James it says, forgive and it shall be given you. In the New American Standard, pardon and you will be pardoned. Let me quickly, to acquit, to remit, to forgive. Okay, so it's the acquittal, or the pardon is the forgiveness. If we put condemn on one side, the natural word for forgiveness on the other side would be acquittal. And acquittal means you get to go free. Now that's crazy to think about how we can apply that. I'm going to say this, that if you have forgiven someone, let it go. That's acquittal. Let it go. If you haven't forgiven someone, then take care of business with God, because it's right here. Go on acquitting, and you shall be acquitted. And there's other places for that we don't have the time to go into. So condemnation is the application of judgment. It's the natural progress. And then the positive response to that is go on acquitting, and you'll be acquitted. Verse 38, give, and it will be given to you. Okay? Giving. Let me read Luke chapter 12, verse 17. And this is the parable. We'll get to it in about 2021, 2022. Luke chapter 12, verse 17. It's the parable that Jesus gave about the rich man. And it starts in verse 17. And the rich man began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Remember what he did? He said, I've got so much abundance, I know I'll tear this barn and that barn down, and I'll build a bigger barn for all my excess stuff. And remember how that ends? You fool. Can you imagine how different that story would have been if the guy says, I have so much abundance, who can I share it with? Compassion. Sharing with those who don't have enough. Wow. And then Paul reiterated that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. Paul says this, Now this I say, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. Now, oftentimes, and I'm just going to say this, oftentimes we think in terms, especially the televangelists, they apply this so much to filthy lucre. You give tenfold to this ministry and God will give you. It's like, man, what a limited scope. Just think about, okay, we have enough to live on. That's fantastic. We're happy. So what I'm saying with that statement is, and the we is generic, it's not Kathy and I. We have enough to live on. So we're not going to be giving away cash, so to speak. Well, what about a friend in need? What about a phone call? What about a letter? About once a month I write to a man in prison. personal person. It's a person I know. He doesn't have a lot of options, but he gets a letter from who he calls Uncle Wayne, and Wayne sends, by the way, one of these, and it's like payday for him. He just can't wait to get the next episode from Uncle Wayne. Giving. Did I give him any money? No. But what did I give him? I gave him a part of me. I gave him a part of Jesus. I gave him part of his word. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. Giving. What this measure is, and what this measure is, and it's hard to describe, and I didn't see a picture, and I'm very a visual person, but it's a fold in the robe that they could pull out, and you could actually put stuff in and carry it. Now, because I didn't see a picture, that's the best I can do. But what this is, and you can play it out wherever you want. You buy a pound of something, and the person puts this and measures it, and it says a pound. And what this says is that I promise you a pound. And so they put the pound in, and they shake it down, and there's a little room at the top. So they put a little more on the top, and it's a little more than a pound. You're guaranteed a pound plus with this kind of concept. I remember years ago, Kathy and I went on a extended honeymoon from Oregon to California, and we pulled into this, I couldn't tell you what food place it was, but because we never get soda, I ordered the 14 quart or the 5-gallon bucket, whatever. It was a big cup, and it had a straw, and I got it and went back to the car, and I went, and it was empty. It was filled with ice and this much soda. And this was in the days when you didn't have refills. I can just tell you that my countenance fell. And I went back and demanded that they put soda, they refill it, which nobody did in 1975. So this is not that. Somebody doesn't fill the bottom with sand and then put the what you bought on top. Somebody doesn't fill it with ice and then gives you 2 droplets of whatever you're drinking. Go on giving, and it shall be given to you, an excellent, a good measure. And there's 2 perfects here. Having been pressed down. So it's like they shake it, they push it down to make sure there's no airspace. They shake it again, they push it down again. And that's the kind of measurement that's given back to you when you have a giving spirit. I tell you, these concepts are so simple. They're so simple. So, as we reach the end of this, what does compassion accomplish? Well, it changes the way I look at my audience, at others, wherever I am, because my being has been adjusted. And I am indeed, as it's stated in the previous verse, I am indeed the Son of the Most High God. God doesn't want us to judge others. He wants to do that in His role. He wants our judgment to stay nailed to the cross. So God judged us already. He wants that to stay there. And we then don't judge others, which leads to condemnation, which is the conclusion of judging, the verdict of judging put into action. It's the application, the carrying out of judgment. Instead of that, we need to acquit. We need to let it go. On top of that, we are to have a generous heart. A generous heart. So in conclusion, our being, our true self, the real me, will reveal the beggarly heart of verse 20. It will reflect my Father's heart. It will affect my outlook and lead to my actions. If it does so positively, the outcome, when and where it really counts, will be positive. Otherwise, we will only be rich, as is stated under the woes in this life. So, my friends, as we consider the precepts and promises that Jesus gave us while he was here, he is still speaking to us today in 2020. So 2,000 years later, his voice still reaches into my heart and says, buddy, be transformed. I've given you everything you need to be transformed. And he raises his hand and points to himself. It's me. So let us this week not forget the Sermon on the Mount, the precepts, the promises, the directives. They're all there by God's grace for us to grow in him. Father, we are so grateful for what you've given. It's clear. It's, when it gets down to it, concise, pithy. The concepts dig deep into our very being. And Lord, whether we be young or whether we be old, we are always called to be these things. Let us look at our hearts of compassion, Father, and be ready and willing to submit to you at a moment's notice. We do, Father, this week give ourselves to you and invite you to take us from where we are and lead us to where we need to be for Christ's sake.